Thank you,
Simpiwe.
Okay, welcome everyone. So thanks for coming to this new meeting on World Environment Day. And we are very pleased to host Fons, who's a professor at the University of Maastricht, who's head of the Center for Human Rights, which does a lot of work around social and economic rights in Maastricht. And he's been a long time collaborator on various projects. So for World Environment Day, we thought we'd ask him to talk about the right to a healthy environment, and does it exist? And so, over to you, Fons.
Okay, thank you very much, Leslie. Indeed, it's quite special to hold this talk on World Environment Day. I didn't realize that it was World Environment Day until Leslie told me about it. So I think it's an appropriate topic for today. There's a lot of talk about pollution, climate change, greenhouse gas emissions, and how it will affect, let's say, our daily lives. And also, and I want to stress that, also probably the lives of future generations. That's a topic in which I'm very much interested. What does law have to say about the protection of the rights of future generations? So my focus today will be on the human rights perspective to a healthy environment, and ask the question whether the human right to a clean or healthy or satisfactory environment exists. And I have deliberately chosen the three terms clean, healthy, and satisfactory because they are quite important, at least from a legal perspective. And I will ask the question whether this right, as it exists, because I will show you that it exists in a number of international documents, whether that is enforceable for an individual. Can you go to court and claim your rights to a healthy environment? And is it really a human right? Is it really related to the protection of human dignity? Because that is the fundamental question that needs to be asked. Human rights relate to the protection of elements of human dignity. Or is the right perhaps not an enforceable right, so not an individual right that you can claim, but is it primarily directed towards the government of a country, so that the government should do something actively? And I will give you an example of a recent case from the Netherlands, a court case, the so-called Urgenda case. Maybe you have heard about it. It's quite groundbreaking because the judges in the Netherlands went quite far in coming to a conclusion that the right to a healthy environment perhaps does not exist explicitly, but there are some clues and possibilities to derive some obligations for the state from other human rights. And I will show you which human rights these are. Okay, now you are familiar with what has been in the news recently, the fires in the Amazon rainforests, Amazon rainforests, which have been called the lungs of the world. They provide oxygen for the world as a whole. And the question was raised, this is a picture, so the yellow picture, the yellow color indicates the locations where the forest fires were early September of this year. And fires were, well, they started man-made often, to create new land for agriculture, cattle grazing, but also for mining. And the question was raised, and I think you have read about it in the press. The president of France said, well, Mr. Macron, he said, this is a common concern of mankind. Or is it perhaps only, as the president of Brazil, Bolsonaro, said, well, no, this is purely a domestic matter. The outside world should not interfere with these kind of issues. There are some possibilities already in international environmental law which provide for the notion of common but differentiated responsibilities. So what kind of responsibilities do different countries have? For example, do developed states have higher responsibilities, more duties than countries from the north? And I will explain you later on how that notion already exists in international environmental law. So there are links with the right to a healthy environment, and that should be taken into account. This is another example of also a recent picture taken from in Indonesia. I think it was in Jakarta, the capital. This is the haze that periodically comes up as a result of forest fires in other parts of Indonesia, polluting the air, which is of course very negative for the health situation of the local people. And other states, like Malaysia, they have also complaints against Indonesia for doing nothing, or at least not enough, to contain these fires, and giving a lot of opportunities to corporations, for example, to burn down the rainforest for palm oil plantations. That's really a difficult problem. You can see the situation is quite serious. I've been in Jakarta. It's not a pleasant capital to live. That's why they have planned to move it to another island. Okay, so the right to a clean environment. There are already quite a number of documents that provide for, let's say, what I would call environmental rights. And one of the first documents dates back to 1972, the well-known Stockholm Declaration. Principle 1, man has the fundamental right to freedom, equality, and adequate conditions of life in an environment of equality that permits a life of dignity and well-being, and he bears some responsibility to protect and improve the environment for present and future generations. So I think at that time, 1972, that was already quite progressive. Fundamental rights. Okay. The African Charter, which is relevant for this continent, also provides for, in Article 24, for all peoples have the right to a general, satisfactory environment favorable to their development. This is so not an individual right, but a collective right, a right for a people. The right to a general, satisfactory environment favorable to their development. Health is not mentioned, but development is mentioned. The question is, of course, what is development? Should it have a broader or a narrow meaning? And what is the meaning of satisfactory? From a legal perspective, this is quite important, and I will come back to that in a minute. The Netherlands Constitution, it's not very progressive. Article 21, it shall be the concern of the authorities to keep the country habitable and to protect and improve the environment, full stop. So it's quite conservative. It's not a right for the individual, but it's a task for the government. And also, I will also come back to that later on. While in your country, your constitution, I think you know it, is much more progressive. Section 24 indeed provides for the right to, everyone has the right to an environment that is not harmful to their health or well-being. And a number of other rights that can be derived from this. And there is also reference to, let me say, I think to future generations, yes, under section B, through reasonable legislative and other measures. The question is, of course, and I'm not that familiar with the South African case law, whether there have been any cases where individuals have invoked this right before the courts. The question is, of course, well, this sounds very nice on paper, but what should the state do to implement the rights? Does it contain any obligations, real obligations that can also be enforced? I will show you later on that in this Dutch agenda case, there were possibilities to force the government to do more than it used to do. So when we talk about, let's say, developing new human rights, a number of criteria need to be met. And that is called the so-called proliferation of rights, adding new human rights to the human rights catalog. And the right to a healthy environment is one of those examples. And there have been other examples in the past, like the right to water, which did not exist as a human right when those international treaties were drafted in the 1950s and 60s, but it was added later as a result of some lobby work by non-governmental organizations and human rights organizations, which put pressure on governments to add a new human right to the human rights catalog. Other examples are more trivial. For example, the right to tourism has been suggested. Is there a human right to tourism? It was a serious proposal that was launched many years ago by the World Tourist Organization, but it was never taken seriously. But also, and that is more trivial, someone has suggested that there is a human right to coffee. A human right to coffee. And that means that a person cannot function without a good cup of coffee in the morning. Well, that makes sense, at least to me. So there are a number of criteria that needs to be met. First of all, there must be a social demand. So a demand coming from society that there is a need to lay down in a legal text the protection of a certain value as a right. The right to water, as I said, is a good example because it was successful. You need water to survive. Food is not enough. You need water to survive. And the same can be said about a healthy environment. So a healthy environment is essential for, let's say, for the survival of people, of present generations, but also for future generations. The claim should be related to the protection of human dignity. And I think, like water, a healthy environment is also fundamental for the protection of human dignity. At the short term, but also at the longer term. Again, also in particular for future generations. Then, it begins to be more complex, at least from a legal perspective. The norm itself, so the right itself, needs to be carefully identified and drafted. So, is it sufficient to have a right to a clean, healthy, and satisfactory environment? What do these terms mean? What is the meaning of healthy, clean, or satisfactory environment? That has to be written down into the law. In addition to that, the norm has to be legally binding. So it has to be included into a legally binding document, like a national law, constitution, or an international treaty. And finally, and that is the most difficult, make the norm enforceable. That means that you can go to court and claim your rights. For example, the right to freedom from torture or the right to freedom of expression are rights that are enforceable. You can go to court and claim these rights. And in the majority of cases, you will be successful. It will be much more difficult to enforce the right to a clean and healthy environment. So the meaning of a number of terms needs to be clarified. So what is the meaning of environment? What does it entail? What is the meaning of healthy, clean, or satisfactory? In order to do that, you need, let's say, the academic expertise of different academic disciplines. Lawyers are not that good in describing and incorporating clear definitions of what is the meaning of environment, what is the meaning of healthy, what is the meaning of clear, what is the meaning of satisfactory. So in the law itself, or in the explanation, the explanatory notes, a clear definition should be given so that claimants, individuals, know exactly what their rights are. And that already indicates that there are problems, because it's not that easy. Governments have argued it is not possible to define precisely what is the meaning of the environment, what is the meaning of healthy, what is the meaning of clean, and what is the meaning of satisfactory. That's why, for example, in the European Convention on Human Rights, which is a very detailed international legally document, there is no right to a clean or healthy environment. There's even no right to health in that document. And one of the reasons is that governments are opposed to this because it's not clear, at least in their view, what these terms would mean and whether they can be applied in practice by courts. But sometimes you have to be creative, and judges have done that. So what are the obstacles to the recognition of an independent right to a healthy, clean, and satisfactory environment? So there is, and that's what I just said, governments have argued that the notion of clean, satisfactory, healthy is vague. And it's not possible to lay that down into a law. So the object or the substance of the norm is vague. And that is a fundamental problem, because you can give a right to people, but if it's not clear what it means, then you are there with empty hands. Who is the right holder? Lawyers call this, who is the subject of the right? Who is the right holder? Well, it makes sense, of course, that individuals have this right, but is it also a collective right, so that a group of people have this right? For example, an indigenous group, that's called a people, or a tribe in an African country. Governments are not clear about this, and they say, well, we need to describe this in detail and agree on this in detail before we recognize who the right holder is or should be. Who is the duty holder? That's even more difficult. Of course, one would say it's the national government, the national states. But in light of, let's say, the global character of the environment and the global character of pollution, of climate change, maybe other states can also be seen as duty holders, or the international community as a whole. But of course, other states do not want to accept obligations towards a clean environment with respect to the situation in other countries. So they object to that. The United States is, of course, the most well-known example, but other countries from the north as well. And finally, well, how do we identify whether there is a violation of the right to a healthy environment? So then first of all, we need to identify what the right is, who the right holder is, who the duty bearer is, and what has actually happened. So, for example, if we take the situation in the Amazon rainforest, has there been a violation of the right to a healthy environment? I think the Brazilians would argue, especially the government, that it's not the case. And it is indeed difficult to identify which consequences the forest fires, have on the health situation of the local people, but also worldwide. So there needs to be a causal relationship between what is happening on the ground and the effects on the health situation of the local people, or even people worldwide. And that's not easy to identify. So there have been alternative approaches have been developed for recognizing the relationship between human rights and the environment. And especially in Europe, under the European Convention on Human Rights. So protecting the environment through already existing individual human rights, rights that you can claim directly as an individual, also before the courts. such as the right to life, the right to health, dignity, privacy, water, and adequate standard of living. And that has been called a process of greening human rights, giving existing human rights an environmental protection dimension. And this is a process that has started some years back, but it's now going faster. And one of the key provisions is Article 8 of the European Convention on Human Rights. Everyone has the right to respect for his private and family life, his home, and his correspondence. And you may wonder, what does that have to do with a healthy environment? But the courts, for example, the European Court of Human Rights, has interpreted this Article 8 as including a number of aspects that relate to the protection of one's health. Let me give you one example of a case about the airport, Heathrow Airport in the UK. I think you all know it. People that were living in that area close to the airport were suffering from a lot of noise pollution and air pollution. And they were not informed about the risks of this by the government. And they went to court and they claimed the right to privacy, family life, and the right to protection of his or her home. And they were successful because the court argued, indeed, these interferences with your privacy and indirectly also with your health may affect the protection of Article 8, may affect and interfere with the right to respect for one's privacy and family life. And that was the first example of a series of judgments where the court, the European Court of Human Rights, has been quite progressive in including a number of environmental risks into the protection of the right to Article 8.
May I ask, when was that?
That was already in the late 1990s, I think some 20 years ago. The case is called Hatton versus the UK. So I think from the right to a healthy environment as a human right, some substantive obligations can be derived. So something that the state must do. If not, then the right to a healthy environment would not make sense. So an obligation to adopt and implement a domestic legal framework to begin with. Then secondly, and that is much more far-reaching, an obligation to protect against environmental harm from private actors, so in particular companies, of course. And thirdly, obligations relating to transboundary environmental harm, and that is even more complicated. Please note that the focus is here on obligations of states and not on rights of individuals. So there is this general right, but if you want to translate that, if you want to make that concrete, the best way to do this is to identify and focus on obligations of states.
What about if the state owns companies that pollute the environment?
Then it's directly the state that is to blame. You mean state-owned companies?
Yes.
Yeah, then it's directly the state. Then the obligation is even perhaps more.
Why is it not listed? Where would that come under?
I think under the first obligation. That would include state-owned companies. Okay, because the second one is about private actors, private companies. Now, a little bit about the Urgenda case. So the Urgenda case, Urgenda is is an NGO, an environmental NGO based in the Netherlands, who is very much working on issues to protect the environment, and in particular has been working on issues about climate change. And to give you some background information, this was a case about the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which was adopted in 1992 by member states of the United Nations. And in that framework convention, states agreed to stabilize greenhouse gas emissions. That was the first step, 1992. Then in 1997, the Kyoto Protocol was added to the framework convention, which set legally binding obligations for developed states to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And then finally, we have the 2015 Paris Agreement, agreed to limit global warming to less than 2 degrees Celsius. So this provides the legal background of that case. Urgenda argued, and here you see, this is the director of the Urgenda organization and the lawyers. And when they started the case, well, there was a lot of doubts whether the case would be dealt with by the judges or whether they would be successful. But they argued, and that was their main argument, that the Dutch government had not done enough to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So it was the task, so it had not fully complied with their obligations under the 1992 United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. That was their main argument. And surprisingly, the Court of First Instance argued, and this is quite progressive, at least in Europe. I'm not sure whether it would be quite progressive here in South Africa. But the Court of First Instance argued, so the Hague District Court in 2015 argued that the state plays a crucial role in the transition to a sustainable society, and therefore has to take on a high level of care for establishing an adequate and effective statutory and instrumental framework to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions in the Netherlands. So a high level of care is something that was quite new, at least that a court would argue this. So a rather strict duty of care. And this is a fundamental aspect in the judgment, the duty of care of the state. So in the opinion of the court, the possibility of damages for those whose interest Urgenda represents, including, and that's also quite progressive, including current and future generations of Dutch nationals, is so great and so concrete that it gives that given its duty of care, the state must make an adequate contribution greater than its current contribution to prevent hazardous climate change. So it means that it must do more. The government cannot lean back and say, well, we are doing enough. And there was a foreseeable risk of climate change and the negative consequences this would have also to the human rights of people. And which human rights, one stake I will show you in a minute. So there was a foreseeable risk. And taking that into account, there's a strong duty of care. And surprisingly, in appeal, the decision was maintained. So by the Hague Court of Appeal. The state has a positive obligation, so has to do something actively to protect the lives of citizens, and an obligation to protect the right to home and private life. And that is directly derived from the European Convention, Article 8. This obligation applies to all activities, public and non-public, which could endanger these rights, and certainly in the face of industrial activities, which by their very nature are dangerous. If the government knows that there is a real and imminent threat, the state must take precautionary measures to prevent infringements as far as possible. So, this duty of care of the states can be derived from a number of already existing human rights. And they mention the right to home and the right to private life, but they also mention in the judgment the right to life, which is of course the most fundamental right, Article 2 of the European Convention. Now, of course, the states did not like this, and they went in appeal to the Supreme Court, and that case is still pending. And one of the arguments that the governments presented is that this is not the job of the courts to deal with these kind of issues. It's the job of Parliament and the executive, the legislator and the executive, to set priorities, to make political choices about what kind of measures should be taken. And that has to do with what lawyers call the separation of powers between the judiciary, the executive, and the legislator. But these kind of arguments were overruled by the other two courts in the case so far. So let's wait and see the final judgment, and then after that there is no appeal possible, is expected, I think, at the end of this year.
So would that be a Dutch court or a European court?
No, it's a Dutch court. The Supreme Court is the highest Dutch court.
They go to a European court if they fail.
The state cannot go.
So individuals could go.
Yeah.
So if a offender lose the appeal, they could go to the European
Yeah.
court.
Yeah, yeah. And then invoking Article 8 and Article 2. Yeah. Okay, there is also the possibility, when you want to invoke your human right to a healthy environment, by invoking a number of procedural rights to raise environmental issues. For example, and I won't take too much time on this, the right to information of individuals, a duty to assess environmental impacts and make information public, the right to participate in public decision making. I think all these rights are also well known here in South Africa, and the right to have access to a court, legal and administrative remedies. If you think your rights have been violated, you should have a remedy. Some conclusions, also looking at the clock. As a self-standing collective right, the right to a healthy environment is still weak. So the right that you have as a group, as a collective, is still weak. It's difficult to go to courts, especially under international human rights law. So as a self-standing collective right, it's weak. Please note that in the Agenda case, the claimants did not invoke the right to a healthy environment. They used other already existing rights. But as an individual claim, it is composed of some substantive elements, like the protection of life, health, private life, home, and procedural elements, information, participation, access to court, and derived from other rights. What is important, and cases have shown this, the emerging duty of care of the state, so a general duty for the state to respect, protect, and fulfill the environment, negative and positive obligations. So to abstain from polluting the environment, but also positive obligations to do something actively to reduce, for example, the level of greenhouse gas emissions. So this duty of care is important. So what is the added value of a human right to a healthy environment? I think the added value is that the right to a healthy environment adds something extra to what the already existing human rights do not offer. And that is the protection against, let's say, overall risks of pollution, degradation of the environment, and you need this extra dimension that can be used also in court procedures. But that requires a need to translate environmental issues into human rights language. So to come up with strong cases where environmental issues are at stake, but you need to translate that into existing human rights, right? Right, like the right to life, privacy, or maybe the right to health, or the right to water. And that means that you need creative lawyers to bring these cases. Okay, I think I'll stop here so that we have some time for questions.
I don't know if anybody's here from the Centre for Environmental Rights, but they do a lot of litigation on using the NEMA National Environmental Management Act for claiming individual rights. Anyway, I'll try to look it up.
So, would occupational health fit in terms of a workplace environment if you went for the non-specific aspects of, that you covered?
Occupational health. Well, for example, is occupational health, is that, so you mean occupational health at the workplace, huh?
Yes, so healthy workplace environment.
Yeah, so that could be part of this environment, the notion of environment. But that means that it's private, so it's the environment of a corporation. That's what you mean. So, and I think that's the obligation that can be derived from this notion, the obligation to protect against environmental harm from private actors. So there is an obligation for the state domestically to oversee the occupational health situation at the workplace. For me, there is no doubt about that.
So in fact, the right to health in the Covenant on Social and Economic Cultural Rights actually talks about industrial hygiene and environmental health. And the general comment, which is the expert elaboration of the right to health, has a lot to say about prevention of endemic occupational and environmental harms. I can't remember the exact
infectious diseases.
Yeah, but there's a lot of text in there which actually speaks directly to both workplace and environmental risks.
And there is
the right to health.
And there's a lot of international standard setting about this in the framework of the International Labour Organization. A lot.
Sure. So I'm just grappling with this issue in terms of you posited whether one would have a separate clause around environmental health versus tagging it on to existing rights. Yep. So I was wondering if you tagged it on to other rights, whether it would adequately protect working people, as opposed to having a very specific right which talks about the environment.
True. I agree with you that the protection of occupational health and the risks as a result of pollution, for example, at work, are not well covered by the existing human rights treaties and documents. So maybe there is a need to expand the scope of protection to include more explicitly the situation of occupational health. That's true, at least from a human rights perspective. Because the right to privacy cannot be invoked. The right to home also is difficult. The right to maybe an adequate standard of living, I'm not sure. But you're right. Yeah. Maybe there's a lacuna.
I'll just read from the Covenant.
Yeah.
The Article 12 of the Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, which South Africa has ratified. State parties to the present covenant recognize the right of everyone to the enjoyment of the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health. The steps to be taken by state parties to address the full realization of rights shall include provision for the reduction of stillbirth rate and infant mortality, B, the improvement of all aspects of environmental and industrial hygiene, C, prevention, treatment and control of epidemic, endemic, occupational and other diseases. So it's very strong under the right to health.
Right to health.
So, if I may, it's also, I think, adequately covered by the Health and Safety Act. It's not implemented, but the Act itself is very clear as to what's expected of employers.
You mean in South Africa?
In South Africa.
No, I'm aware of all of that. I'm just thinking at the mental level, in relation to that, because I know when we were discussing social and economic rights for the Constitution, there was a whole big debate around, we wanted to include the workplace environment, but at the end of the day, it was left as generic environment in our Constitution as well. There's no reference. So the argument there was the workplace environment is subsumed under the broader environment, and that's why it was not specifically specified the workplace environment.
Yeah, but still, I want to stress the importance of these ILO conventions, and I assume that South Africa has ratified a number of these. They are not well known, but they are important. They are very, very detailed, very specific, and they need to be transposed into domestic law. I'm not sure whether this happens in South Africa.
It is reasonably, like the gentleman said, around the Occupational Health and Safety Act and the Mine Health and Safety Act. It does cover those things, but it's almost like it's not necessarily taking its cue from this kind of broader matter, except when there's negotiations at the ILO level for conventions, when these come.
Sorry, I also have a question, and that is our state-owned electricity company.
ESCOM.
ESCOM, yeah. Even as a foreigner, I know what ESCOM is.
Right, ESCOM. It borrowed something like $4 billion in order to build what was then one of the largest coal-fired power stations in the world. As you will know, there was opposition to that. Now, I work for an organization, the Alternative Information and Development Sector, and we investigating the possibilities of using the doctrine of odious debt to challenge the legality of that. And one of the arguments would be that it manifestly wasn't in the interest of the general population. So it's not only climate change in general, but also because ESCOM itself has the figures as to how many people it kills each year, because it can't meet even South Africa's pathetically low air quality standards. So I'm delighted to hear there's now international law, because our constitution also recognizes the validity of international law. And I'm wondering if it becomes appropriate, could we contact you as an expert witness?
Or my colleagues, why not? Why not? Yeah.
In which case, may I have 3 cards, please?
But you would argue, let's say, so building these new electricity plants is totally contrary to the obligations of the state.
Yes.
It's a state-owned company.
Yes.
But on the other hand, the state has to provide for enough electricity for its citizens. So it has to balance.
But it doesn't.
It doesn't.
But it doesn't have to be coal-fired.
Okay.
And of course, Jeff has not added the fact that the cost is hugely overrun.
There's no shortage of additional arguments.
So there's not not yet a policy in South Africa about renewable
But
energy.
there
There is, but not enough.
And our government is very vocal internationally in saying we absolutely must do something about climate change.
Yeah.
We're ready to do whatever's required,
Yeah.
but we can't be the first to do it because it will make our business uncompetitive.
So Eskom has produced a policy for renewable energy providers to feed into the grid. But they basically stalled on that for a number of years while people were planning to invest in renewables. And it was during that period that this Kusile and Medupe were approved. So at the same time that they were stalling on making it possible for renewables to generate energy, they were deciding to build this coal plant.
If I may, I think it's even worse than that. The government's policy at that time was they were looking for private investors. And unfortunately, they weren't, because at that stage, the electricity price was amongst the lowest in the world, and therefore it wasn't attractive
Yes, I
for
understand.
foreign investment.
Yeah.
So they delayed any decision
Yeah.
until it was too late.
But
Then we
it's
ran out of electricity.
of course essentially a political issue. Huh?
Yes,
It requires political will.
yes.
And we discussed earlier this week about, let's say, how do you determine a violation of what is called the social economic rights. And what is essential is to distinguish between whether the state is unable to comply with its obligations versus the unwillingness. And I think in this case, it's clearly an example of unwillingness. It is, South African state is able, but not willing. And that could be qualified as a violation.
Our witness number one.
So you should probably also look at the South African government submission to the Committee on Social,
Yeah.
Economic and Cultural Rights, where they would have commented on what they're doing for the environment. So you could use
Looking
that.
to you for that,
Yeah.
please.
Yeah, so I just want to ask on the more positive. So we mentioned the negative aspects of environmental rights, preventing pollution, degradation, etc. But we're looking at other rights like the right to water, the right to food, some more positive rights.
Yeah.
You know, and so I was wondering about positive environmental rights, such as the right to access electricity, the right to access the internet. What's your thoughts on that?
You mean whether these should be recognized as human rights?
That's right.
The right to electricity, or the right... Yeah, that's part of the discussion I raised earlier about whether adding new human rights should make sense. So, for example, the right to have access to internet, I think you don't need that because you can use the right to information. The right to also to seek information is a recognized human right. There's no doubt about that. The right to electricity or energy, yeah. My colleagues from Groningen University in the Netherlands have indeed suggested this, that this should be added to the human rights catalogue. It was not an issue in the 1940s and 1950s, but it's very much an issue now. And would you argue a right for renewable energy? Clean, okay.
Post-nuclear fusion potential.
Yeah. I think you would have a strong case, but then you still need to identify who is the right holder, who is the and what exactly is this slide. Is it sufficiently clear what energy would means? Electricity, is it only for personal use or is it also for companies? Who is the right holder? Is it the individual? That would mean that every single house should be connected to the electricity net. Who's the duty holder? Well, would that be the states or private companies? Well, in many countries you have private companies that are responsible for providing electricity. So, but I think you're right, and I would agree with that. Yeah. But the right to internet, I have my doubts. I think you don't need it.
Go to slide 16. I was struck by
This one.
precautionary measures. So in my understanding, the precautionary principle
Yeah.
applies where there's uncertainty.
Yeah.
But the way that's framed,
Yeah, exactly.
is actually there's no uncertainty there. There's a real evident threat.
Yeah.
So the precautionary measure is not used in the same way as the
No,
precautionary
no.
principle there.
So there was in the judgment, but I did not quote that, it was said that there is no doubt, also from scientific perspective, about the risks of environmental degradation and climate change on the rights of people. Yeah. But did you right? Yeah.
Okay. Can I take you out from the internet one? I would argue that in this day and age, access to information is a game changer in terms of your own self-actualization and development.
Mm-hmm.
So why would it be no-go in relation?
No. If the question is, do we need a right to internet as a human right, or the right to have access to internet? I think the right to information, and in particular that I mentioned, the right to seek information, is already protected. But of course, I can imagine that in some parts of the world, its accessibility of the right to internet is a problem.
And yet, the Western Cape government and other provincial governments have made it a priority to provide internet access to subjects in their province, aside from the other obligations that they may not be fulfilling properly. And then Gavin's point, could this not all be subsumed in the whole issue around development? Because it's really about development, right? And whether I choose to burn a fire or whether it should be up to me, I may not want electricity because it's being produced by a nuclear plant.
So you mean the question whether people would have a choice?
Yeah, I was just wondering whether electricity is so specific that it kind of boxes one into kind of not explore other kind of potential sources of energy, like renewables.
Yeah, like wind energy or
wind and solar, and all of those.
But I think that would be included in your right to energy, or electricity.
So more energy rather than electricity.
Okay. There was a question over there. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I've been wondering, most of these issues center around the states.
The states, yeah.
On one side, the states is supposed to, an act supposed to provide. On one side is supposed to safeguard. Electricity, for example, as a right.
Mm-hmm.
Then they will argue that on feasibility terms, we are able to provide electricity from these sources. They will argue based on the level of development the state feels we can afford these things. And the state is tasked probably to be inclusive of the social groups. And then there are other social groups which will say we need electricity as a right, but if you provide electricity from this source, we may not be able to access in terms of paying for the electricity.
Yeah.
So, is it possible in the law to have a state as both the provider and the police, the same contested number one, and then circumscribe to then say, while ensuring there is access to electricity as a fundamental right, you shall not provide it from sources that degrade the environment for current and future generations. Is it possible? I would think yes. I don't know.
It should be possible, but I think you are very progressive in your thoughts, in the sense that this is what you're saying now is not something that governments would agree to. Although there is a slow change in the thinking about indeed clean energy, renewable energy, but what would count in the end, if we talk about the right to electricity or the right to, especially for vulnerable social groups is that they have access to energy, that energy is accessible and affordable. I think that's the key issue. And those people, the most vulnerable groups, are perhaps less interested what is the source of electricity, where it comes from, whether it's from fossil fuels or from renewable energy. And that could also have an impact on the price, on the fee people have to pay.
In a way, I mean, the price we pay for electricity bears no relation to the real cost, because it's all externalized anyway. So it would be up to the state to regulate prices such that people could afford it, and there's cross subsidy, whether it's electricity or healthcare or whatever the case may be.
But there is a human rights risk when these kind of essential services are being outsourced to the private sector. So we have seen examples of water privatization in Latin America, and they turn out to be very negative because people were not, especially the poor parts of the population, were not able to pay for that. So in the end, the situation was even worse than it used to be.
We've more or less run out of time on this. Anybody has any last comments? So just to thank Fons very much.
Thank you.